This presentation aims to answer the question, in what sense and in what ways are Slaughterhouse 5 and the Bloody Chamber engaged in rewriting? Firstly, we must understand some background knowledge about postmodern fiction and then answer the question of what is meant by the term rewriting. As Mikhail says, postmodernism can be considered to move on from where modernism left off. The difference between modernist and postmodern fiction is a difference between epistemology and ontology. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that is concerned with the nature of knowledge itself. Ontology is a branch of metaphysics that is concerned with identifying what actually exists. However, Lyotard argues that postmodern fiction puts forward the unpresentable in presentation itself. This will be highly fitting to both Slaughterhouse 5 and the Bloody Chamber. These two theories will lead the presentation through its journey to answer how are the two text forms of rewriting. So what is actually meant by the term rewriting? The Cambridge Dictionary defines rewriting to be to write something such as a book or speech again in order to improve it or change it because new information is available. However, this does not feel like a solidified meaning when applying this term to the two texts. The first part of the definition says to write something again. However, both texts are originals. They do not rewrite other books, and they certainly haven't wrote them due to new information being made available. Kessler's definition seems much more fitting when answering the question, as they say, in rethinking relationships between language and cultural politics, as postmodernism asks us to do, we engage in the process of revisiting history and constructing meaning, which necessarily involves addressing questions concerning the relationships between those processes and concepts of community, identity, and power. From this definition, Slaughterhouse 5 and the Bloody Chamber can both be applied, and this definition will be used throughout to glean insight. First, we will look in depth at Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Slaughterhouse 5 is a satirical novel that takes place during World War II and is seen through the narrator's eyes, Billy Pilgrim. This novel can be argued to be a rewriting of the bombing of Dresden, making it therefore a rewriting of history. Fries argues, any writer who tries to reconstruct a historical atrocity of such unimaginable proportions by means of traditional fictional strategies, that is, by storifying the event through an individual narrative perspective, is bound to fail. However, how far is this actually true? Although Slaughterhouse 5 is arguably a fictional narrative, the author, Vonnegut himself, could be seen to be using the novel as an autobiography about his experience of the bombing of Dresden. So can this theory actually apply? Slaughterhouse 5 took him 20 years to write and draws on his own personal experiences. He was an advanced scout within the US Army and was made a prisoner of war in Dresden in an old slaughterhouse, mirroring the events of the protagonist Billy Pilgrim. Therefore, the assumption can be made that Billy Pilgrim is a mirror of Vonnegut himself. The rewriting of the bombing of Dresden appears to be a very reliable one, as Vonnegut was there. However, he has later said, because you can't remember pure nonsense, it was pure nonsense, the pointless destruction of that city. I just couldn't get it right, as I kept writing crap, as they say. This changes the reliability of the novel's rewriting of history and further supports Fries's earlier quote that you are bound to fail. On the other hand, Vonnegut has never stated that this novel is a history book. It is fiction, so does it really matter? In order to assess if it does matter, we need to fully understand what happened within that history. Between the 14th and 15th of February 1945, US and British bombers dropped bombs on Dresden. It has been considered one of the most controversial moments of World War II. Here is an image of Dresden before the bombings. As you can see, it's full of historic buildings and museums. It is also filled with refugees who was trying to escape the war. On the other hand, we see images of Dresden after the bombings, which highlight the mass destruction. We can see corpses and burning bodies, many not recognised as the human form. The devastation is unimaginable. This reinforces the idea, as Vonnegut says, there is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. Therefore, can history actually ever be rewritten? Or are we bound to fail because history can be considered to be a representation of ontology? Did it ever actually happen the way that we are told? Or is history simply storytelling? Here is a quotation taken from the Guardian newspaper by Victor Gregg, who, like Vonnegut, was also there during the Dresden bombings. This reiterates the image further of the destruction, devastation of this mass massacre. Phosphorus clung to the bodies of those below, turning them into human tortures. The screaming of those who were being burned alive was added to the cries of those not yet hit. Developing on from this, Rigney says, Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse 5 was a popular and critical success when it first appeared, and has had notable impact on popular perceptions of the bombing of Dresden, although it has been criticised by historians because of its inaccuracy. The accuracy of the historical event is surely important and must be taken seriously when rewriting the history. So where did Vonnegut get his facts and figures from? He gathered his statistical numbers from David Irving's book, The Destruction of Dresden. Irving is a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier and a self-styled historian. I use the term historian loosely here. His book claimed that between 100 and 250,000 civilians were killed. This, however, was a huge exaggeration. His figures came from Nazi propaganda, and Penguin, the publishing company, gathered together to uncover David for manipulating historical evidence, and the source was later found to be wrong. Here is a newspaper article from the time that almost agrees with the over-exaggerated figures, stating that nearly a year after, they are still digging out the corpses, and the German estimates 250,000 people. So what are the actual figures? Emory University have said, the real death toll, which is terrible enough, is between 20,000 and 35,000. This number is based on records kept at the time about the number of bodies recovered, cremated or buried. This poses the debate between fiction and history. When rewriting history in the form of fiction, is it required to be accurate? To conclude, Vonnegut can definitely be seen to be rewriting history within Slaughterhouse 5, and it supports Lyotard's argument that it puts forward the unpresentable in presentation itself. Slaughterhouse 5 is a work of fiction, not a work of history. It agrees with McHale's argument that it supports the work of ontology of the events in which it narrates. However, some may argue that Slaughterhouse 5 isn't just fiction and that it has a political stand. Without the history, it could just be anti-war propaganda, but the rewriting of history makes it much more than that. This novel is still valued as historically reliable. Moving on to looking at the rewriting within Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, Carter takes classic fairy tales and deconstructs them, arguably rewrites them by putting sex and violence at the forefront of the plot. However, it is not a straightforward rewrite. But where did the fairy tale begin? And what makes a fairy tale? Fairy tales stem right back to the 15th century, surpassing folk tales. They are simply common property and are a form of Chinese whispers, as they began verbally as writing was not a form. The further back we go, the darker and gloomier they are. The sanitation process cleans up the stages of the fairy tale neatly. It begins with Perlot, who focus on underappreciated hard work, how to act ladylike. It then goes on to the Grimm brothers and Hans in the 19th century. By this time there was a wider reading population and children were attending school, making the focus now onto morality and family values. Phase 2 finishes with the makings of films such as Disney and Pixar that feed off the happily ever after and morality fairy tale. One way in which Carter rewrites these fairy tales is by using binary oppositions. Within these rewritings of binary oppositions, we can see metamorphoses running throughout. For example, Beauty becomes the Beast. This retakes that Carter uses these retakes that Carter uses are an undercurrent for a much bigger meaning. They set the reader up to understand this meaning. They go back to the roots of fairy tales and abandon adaptations such as Disney. They express the darker side to life and juxtapose expectations. As Atwood says, The Bloody Chamber may be read as a writing against Desailles, as an exploration of the possibilities for the kind of synthesis Desailles himself could never find. Predator and prey, master and slave are the only two categories that he can acknowledge. Above all, for him, sex between unequals can be mutually pleasurable, making the argument that Carter has actually rewritten these fairy tales much stronger, and that these binary oppositions are a product of this. But this then raises the question, can fairy tales actually be rewritten? Is there actually no original fairy tales? There actually isn't. So how can you rewrite something that doesn't have an original? They are fallacy. Is Carter simply bringing the revival of traditional old folk fairy tales in comparison to rewriting them? This would be a valid suggestion. However, Carter uses already functioning and well-known fairy tale characters such as Little Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast, for example, so she is therefore rewriting fairy tale traditions. Here is a clip from Family Guy that is similar to Carter.
All right,
and
the
also
next
Mark.
story is Little Red Riding Hood. Red Riding Hood was choosing her clothes for a journey across the forest.
You know, if I had the guts, I would be Little White Turtleneck. By guts, I mean body.
Red, don't forget this basket of food for Grandma.
This whole thing is way too heavy. Why are you putting a bag of ice in here? Is this a Coors party ball? Is Grandma going to be entertaining Florida jet ski people?
Remember, stay on the path and you'll be fine.
Oh, yes, great advice from Mother of the Year. You do realize Grandma lives 68 miles away, right? You're sending your child out there to die.
Postmodern writers and directors appear to be spoofing and mocking this new fairy tale and rewriting them with a more current representation. However, these representations appear to mirror folk fairy tales and show a darker side to reality. To conclude, Carter rewrites fairy tales in order to fit a feminist agenda, making the woman superior to the male. For example, the young girl is rescued by her mother rather than a male figure. By rewriting these fairy tales, it gives a voice to the female protagonist rather than being a damsel in distress. However, is this simply a parody? It can be argued that it has much more than of a purpose to be a parody. Carter's clearly recycling and rewriting traditional fairy tales, even if the rewrite isn't straightforward. They are developments on the dark traditional fairy tale. So what's next? When will writers begin to rewrite Disney, such as Frozen, and will it serve a similar purpose to Carter's rewrites? Thank you for listening.